August 6, 1945, 8:15 a.m. The city of Hiroshima, Japan, awakened to another day of war. Children walked to school. Workers headed to factories. Air raid sirens had sounded earlier, but were silenced when only 3 American planes appeared overhead, too few to worry about. But inside one of those B-29 bombers, a weapon unlike anything in human history sat armed and ready. A single bomb that weighed less than 5 tons, but contained the power of 15,000 tons of TNT. A weapon that would kill 80,000 people in an instant and end the bloodiest war humanity had ever known. This is the story of the Manhattan Project, the most expensive, most secretive, and most consequential scientific program ever undertaken. A 3-year race against time that brought together the greatest minds of a generation, cost more than the entire U.S. automobile industry, and created a weapon so powerful that it would change the very nature of war, politics, and human civilization itself. Before we begin this journey into the heart of the atomic age, hit that subscribe button and join Past Oracle as we explore the stories that shaped our world. Our story begins not with soldiers or politicians, but with scientists pursuing pure knowledge. In December 1938, 2 German chemists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, conducted an experiment in Berlin that would change everything. They bombarded uranium atoms with neutrons, expecting the uranium to absorb them and become slightly heavier. Instead, something impossible happened. The uranium atoms split apart. When their colleague, physicist Lise Meitner, analyzed the results from exile in Sweden, she had fled Nazi Germany because she was Jewish, she realized what had occurred. The uranium nucleus had undergone fission, splitting into smaller elements. And in that split, according to Einstein's famous equation E=mc2, a tiny amount of matter had been converted into energy, an enormous amount of energy. Meitner calculated the numbers and was stunned. A single uranium atom splitting released 200 million electron volts of energy, millions of times more than any chemical reaction. But the truly terrifying implication came next. When uranium split, it released additional neutrons. Those neutrons could strike other uranium atoms, causing them to split and release more neutrons. A chain reaction. Theoretically, if you had enough uranium in one place, and if you could make the chain reaction proceed fast enough, the energy release would be catastrophic. A handful of uranium could equal thousands of tons of conventional explosives. The news spread through the physics community like wildfire. In January 1939, Niels Bohr brought word of fission to America. Within weeks, physicists across the country were reproducing the experiments. At Columbia University, Enrico Fermi, an Italian refugee who had fled Mussolini's fascist regime, began investigating whether a sustained chain reaction was possible. At Princeton, Eugene Wigner and Leo Szilard, both Hungarian Jews who had escaped Europe, immediately understood the military implications. Szilard was terrified. He knew that the best physicists in the world were in Germany. If Nazi scientists developed an atomic bomb first, Hitler would be unstoppable. In August 1939, Szilard convinced Albert Einstein, the world's most famous scientist, to sign a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt warning that Germany might be developing atomic weapons. The letter reached Roosevelt just as World War II began in Europe. The president's response was cautious, but clear. This requires action. The initial American effort was small and uncoordinated. A committee was formed. Some research money was allocated. Scientists at various universities investigated different aspects of the problem. But there were enormous questions to answer before any bomb could be built. First, natural uranium wouldn't work. It contained 2 isotopes, U-238, which made up 99.3% of all uranium, and U-235, which was only 0.7%. Only U-235 would sustain a fast chain reaction. Separating these isotopes was incredibly difficult because they were chemically identical and had almost the same mass. Existing separation methods could produce only tiny quantities. Second, there was another possibility. If you bombarded U-238 with neutrons in a controlled environment, some would be absorbed and transmuted into a new element that didn't exist in nature, plutonium. Theory suggested plutonium might also sustain a chain reaction, but no one had ever made more than microscopic traces of it. Third, no one knew exactly how much fissile material would be needed. The critical mass depended on purity, density, and geometry. Too little, and the neutrons would escape before sustaining a chain reaction. Enough, and you'd have a bomb, possibly one that would explode spontaneously the moment you assembled it. For 2 years, progress was slow. Then came Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and America was at war. Suddenly, the atomic bomb project became urgent. In 1942, the government reorganized everything under the Army Corps of Engineers and gave it a deliberately bland codename, the Manhattan Engineering District. The Manhattan Project had begun. To lead it, the Army chose an unlikely figure. Brigadier General Leslie Groves was an engineer who had just finished overseeing construction of the Pentagon. He was efficient, demanding, and ruthless about cutting through bureaucracy. He was also arrogant and difficult, qualities that would prove essential. Groves's first act was to secure the project's budget. He requested and received funding with virtually no oversight. The final cost would exceed $2 billion, equivalent to over $30 billion today, making it the second most expensive program of World War II after the B-29 bomber. Groves' second act was to recruit a scientific director. He needed someone brilliant enough to command respect from the greatest physicists alive, but practical enough to turn theory into working weapons. He chose J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist from Berkeley. The choice was controversial. Oppenheimer had never managed a large project. He had never won a Nobel Prize. He had left-wing political associations that made security officials nervous. But Groves saw something others missed. Oppenheimer had the ability to understand the entire problem, from physics to engineering to politics, and he could inspire people. The Manhattan Project would eventually employ over 130,000 people at sites across the country. Most had no idea what they were building. 3 entire cities were constructed in secret, erased from maps, and surrounded by armed guards. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, became the site for uranium enrichment. In 1942, it was farmland. By 1945, it was the 5th largest city in Tennessee, home to 75,000 workers. Massive facilities operated around the clock, using 3 different methods to separate U-235 from U-238. The electromagnetic separation plant was the size of several football fields. The gaseous diffusion plant consumed 1/7 of all electricity used by the entire United States. Workers operated equipment without knowing what it produced. Operators at control panels were told only to keep certain needles within certain zones. Women who operated calutrons, massive electromagnetic separators, thought too young. Hey, we're making radio parts. Hanford, Washington was built to produce plutonium. The government seized 670 square miles of desert along the Columbia River and constructed massive reactors. These weren't reactors for generating electricity. That technology didn't exist yet. They were plutonium production reactors, designed to bombard uranium with neutrons and create the new element atom by atom. The first reactor, B reactor, began operating in September 1944. Workers constructed it not knowing that it would produce material for humanity's first atomic weapons. The reactors were so unprecedented that Enrico Fermi's team in Chicago first had to prove that a controlled nuclear chain reaction was even possible. That proof came on December 2, 1942, in a squash court beneath the University of Chicago's Stagg Field. Fermi had built Chicago Pile 1, a stack of uranium and graphite blocks arranged in a precise geometry. As his team slowly withdrew control rods that absorbed neutrons, instruments began detecting increasing radiation. At 3:25 p.m., the chain reaction became self-sustaining, the first controlled nuclear reaction in history. Fermi let it run for 28 minutes, then inserted the control rods to stop it. Physicist Eugene Wigner presented Fermi with a bottle of Italian wine. They drank from paper cups, no one speaking much, knowing they had crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. But the most dramatic site was Los Alamos, New Mexico. Oppenheimer chose it himself, a remote mesa 7,000 feet up in the Jemez Mountains, accessible only by terrible roads, isolated from everything. Here, he would gather the greatest minds in physics to design the actual bombs. The Los Alamos laboratory officially opened in 1943. Within 2 years, its population exceeded 6,000. It had schools, stores, and housing. It also had barbed wire, armed guards, and censored mail. The roster of scientists at Los Alamos reads Lin. Key a who's who of 20th century physics. Enrico Fermi, who had won the Nobel Prize for his work on radioactivity. Hans Bethe, a German refugee who would later win the Nobel Prize for explaining how stars produce energy. Richard Feynman, a brilliant young theorist who entertained himself by picking locks and cracking safes in colleagues' offices. Edward Teller, a Hungarian physicist obsessed with an even more powerful weapon, the hydrogen bomb. Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist who had pioneered quantum mechanics, came to Los Alamos under the code name Nicholas Baker and served as a sage advisor. Many were refugees from fascism, Jews who had fled Germany, Austria, Italy, and Hungary. They worked on the bomb not out of love for destruction, but out of terror that Hitler might get it first. They had left behind families, colleagues, and entire worlds destroyed by the Nazi regime. For them, the bomb was a race against the darkest regime in modern history. The work was divided into divisions. Theoretical physics calculated how much fissile material was needed and how to arrange it. Experimental physics tested those theories. Chemistry groups worked on purifying uranium and plutonium. Metallurgy groups figured out how to cast and machine these strange new materials. Ordnance groups designed the mechanisms that would hold everything together and trigger the explosion. The challenges were immense. Plutonium, when finally produced in quantity, turned out to have unexpected properties. It had multiple isotopes, and the presence of Pu-240 caused spontaneous fission. The bomb design that would work for uranium, a simple gun design that fired one piece of U-235 into another, wouldn't work for plutonium. It would pre-detonate, fizzling instead of exploding. A completely different approach was needed. The solution came from a concept called implosion. Instead of assembling pieces linearly, what if you compressed a sphere of plutonium from all directions simultaneously? The compression would increase density, decreasing the critical mass and starting the chain reaction. But this required explosive lenses, precisely shaped charges that would convert a spherical explosion into a converging spherical shock wave. Nothing like this had ever been attempted. John von Neumann, one of the greatest mathematicians of the century, worked out the theory. George Kistiakowsky, an explosives expert, had to turn theory into reality. They conducted hundreds of test explosions, refining the shapes and timing. Every lens had to detonate within a millionth of a second of the others, or the plutonium would squirt out like a squeezed watermelon instead of compressing symmetrically. Meanwhile, other groups tackled different problems. The bomb would need an initiator, a neutron source that would start the chain reaction at precisely the right moment. Engineers designed a tiny device called the Urchin, a beryllium sphere with polonium coating that would release neutrons when compressed. The bomb would need electronics that could survive massive acceleration and perfectly time multiple detonations. It would need to be small enough to fit in a B-29 bomber, but rugged enough to survive the flight. Life at Los Alamos was strange. Scientists worked 6-day weeks, often late into the night. Security agents watched their every move. Mail was censored. Phone calls were monitored. They couldn't tell their families where they lived or what they did. The address was simply P.O. Box 1663, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Wives arrived at the mesa not knowing where they were going or why. Many scientists brought their families, and a whole community developed in the shadow of absolute secrecy. Yet despite the restrictions, Los Alamos developed a unique culture. Scientists who had been rivals at different universities now collaborated. Oppenheimer ran evening colloquia where anyone could present ideas and anyone could challenge them. Feynman played bongos. Fermi organized excursions into the mountains. People lived with the knowledge that they were creating something unprecedented, something that might end the war, but would certainly change the world. By early 1945, the bomb was taking shape. The uranium gun design bomb, called Little Boy, was relatively simple. Engineers were confident it would work and decided not to test it. Uranium was too scarce to waste on a test. But the plutonium implosion bomb, called Fat Man, was so complex and unprecedented that it had to be tested. Failure was a real possibility. Success would prove that humanity had mastered the atom. The test was codenamed Trinity. A site was chosen in the Jornada del Muerto, Journey of Death, desert in southern New Mexico, part of the Alamogordo bombing range. Engineers constructed a 100-foot steel tower to hold the bomb, placing it high enough that instruments on the ground could measure the blast without being instantly vaporized. The bomb itself, called the Gadget, was assembled at Los Alamos and carefully transported to Trinity site. It was a sphere of plutonium surrounded by explosive lenses, wrapped in uranium tamper to reflect neutrons back into the core, all encased in a metal shell. The plutonium pit was so precious that it was transported by car with armed guards, driven by scientists who had worked on it. They knew that if the car crashed and the pit was lost, the entire project might be delayed by months. Assembly took place in an old ranch house near the tower. Scientists worked in stifling heat, handling explosives and radioactive material with care that bordered on paranoia. On July 12th, the fully assembled Gadget was hoisted to the top of the tower. Detonation was scheduled for July 16th at 4:00 a.m. The night before the test, a fierce thunderstorm rolled across the desert. Lightning struck near the tower. Rain poured down. Oppenheimer and Groves stood in the control bunker, 10,000 yards from ground zero, arguing about whether to postpone. The weather forecast suggested the storm would clear. They decided to wait. At 5:10 a.m., Groves gave the final order. 20 minutes later, the countdown began. Scientists had placed bets on the yield. Estimates ranged from 0, a complete dud, to 45,000 tons of TNT equivalent. A few worried about more exotic possibilities. What if the explosion triggered fusion in the atmosphere, igniting Earth's nitrogen and oxygen in a chain reaction that would destroy the planet? Calculations suggested this was impossible, but no one had ever tested anything like this before. They were entering unknown territory. At 5:29 a.m., the Trinity device detonated. The result exceeded all expectations except the most optimistic. A light brighter than 1,000 suns flashed across the desert. Scientists 10 miles away were blinded even through welding glass. The fireball was so hot that the desert sand melted into glass, trinitite, a new mineral created by humanity. The shock wave rolled across the landscape, knocking observers to the ground. A mushroom cloud rose 7.5 miles into the sky, visible from 200 miles away. The blast yielded approximately 22,000 tons of TNT equivalent, 22 kilotons. The tower vaporized completely. A crater 10 feet deep and 1,100 feet wide marked ground zero. The air in the control bunker smelled of ozone. Some scientists cheered. Others stood in silent shock. Oppenheimer later recalled a line from Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The test had succeeded. Humanity now possessed a weapon that made all previous weapons obsolete. A single bomb could destroy a city. The atomic age had begun. Even as the Trinity test was being prepared, the question of how to use the bomb was being debated at the highest levels. A committee of scientists, military officers, and politicians considered the options. Some scientists argued for a demonstration, detonate a bomb over an unpopulated area to show Japan its power and compel surrender without killing civilians. Others pointed out the risks. What if the bomb failed? What if Japan ignored the demonstration? The United States had only a few bombs, and making more required months of effort. Military planners argued that Japan had shown no willingness to surrender despite devastating conventional bombing campaigns. Tokyo had been firebombed in March 1945, killing over 100,000 people in a single night. Other cities had been systematically destroyed. Yet the Japanese government continued fighting. mobilizing civilians for a final defense of the home islands. Intelligence estimates suggested that invading Japan would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese lives. Against this calculus, using the atomic bomb seemed the lesser evil. President Harry Truman, who had taken office after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, made the final decision. The bomb would be used against Japanese cities without warning, targeting military and industrial centers to demonstrate its power and compel immediate surrender. A list of target cities was prepared: Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki. All had military significance. All had been deliberately spared from conventional bombing so that the atomic bomb's effects could be clearly assessed. On July 26th, the Potsdam Declaration demanded Japan's unconditional surrender and warned of prompt and utter destruction if they refused. The Japanese government rejected it. The military leadership believed they could still negotiate a conditional peace. They had no idea what was coming. Little Boy, the uranium bomb, was loaded aboard the B-29 bomber Enola Gay, commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets. On August 6, 1945, Enola Gay took off from Tinian Island in the Pacific. The bomb was armed in flight, too dangerous to arm on the ground. At 8:15 a.m. local time, flying at 31,000 feet over Hiroshima, bombardier Tom Farabee released Little Boy. It fell for 43 seconds. At 1,900 feet above the city center, the bomb detonated with a yield of approximately 15 kilotons. The center of Hiroshima ceased to exist. A fireball 200 feet across vaporized everything within 1,000 feet of ground zero. People simply vanished, leaving only shadows burned into stone. The blast wave demolished buildings for over a mile. Fires ignited across the city, merging into a firestorm. Of Hiroshima's 350,000 residents, approximately 70,000 died instantly. Another 70,000 would die by year's end from injuries and radiation sickness. The Enola Gay's crew saw the mushroom cloud rising behind them, visible for 400 miles. They had expected a big explosion, but were stunned by what they witnessed. Tail gunner Bob Caron described it as the most terrifying yet magnificent sight a man could see. In Japan, the government struggled to understand what had happened. Initial reports spoke of a single bomb destroying an entire city, but this seemed impossible. Before they could fully investigate, a second bomb was ready. Fat Man, the plutonium implosion bomb, identical to the Trinity device, was loaded aboard a B-29 called Boxcar. The primary target was Kokura, but clouds obscured the city. The pilot diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki. On August 9th, at 11:02 a.m., Fat Man detonated 1,650 feet above Nagasaki with a yield of 21 kilotons. The city's terrain, hills and valleys, limited the blast effects compared to flat Hiroshima, but the destruction was still catastrophic. Approximately 40,000 people died immediately, with another 40,000 dying by year's end. 6 days later, on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast, the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard his voice. World War II was over. The atomic bombs had ended the war, but they had also introduced a new terror into human existence. The immediate aftermath of the bombings was complex and controversial. Military leaders like General Curtis LeMay argued that conventional bombing would have ended the war just as quickly. Some historians claim Japan was already defeated and seeking surrender terms. Others point out that even after Nagasaki, the Japanese military leadership attempted a coup to prevent surrender. The debate continues today, and likely always will. For the scientists who built the bomb, the aftermath brought crisis of conscience. Many had worked on the Manhattan Project believing they were racing against Nazi Germany. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, some felt the justification for the bomb had vanished. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the reality of what they had created became undeniable. Leo Szilard, who had initiated the bomb project with his letter to Roosevelt, spent the rest of his life campaigning for nuclear disarmament. Oppenheimer, at a meeting with President Truman, said he felt he had blood on his hands. Truman, annoyed, later said he never wanted to see that crybaby scientist again. The technological legacy of the Manhattan Project reshaped civilization. The physics discoveries made during the project led to nuclear power, which today generates 10% of the world's electricity. Medical isotopes produced in nuclear reactors save millions of lives through cancer treatment and diagnostic imaging. The computer technology developed for weapons calculations evolved into modern computing. The management techniques used to coordinate thousands of scientists and engineers influenced every major technological project since. But the bomb's most profound legacy was geopolitical. Within 4 years, the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb, aided partly by espionage from within the Manhattan Project. Klaus Fuchs, a German refugee physicist at Los Alamos, had been passing secrets to Soviet agents throughout the war. Britain tested a bomb in 1952, France in 1960, China in 1964. Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea followed. Today, 9 nations possess nuclear weapons totaling approximately 13,000 warheads. The Cold War was defined by nuclear weapons. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction, MAD, meant that any nuclear war between superpowers would destroy both sides. This paradoxically created stability, since neither the United States nor Soviet Union could attack the other without guaranteeing their own annihilation. But it also created constant terror. Children practiced duck-and-cover drills in schools. Families built fallout shelters. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before or since. The story of the Manhattan Project cannot be told without acknowledging the human suffering it caused. The immediate casualties in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were horrific, but the long-term effects were equally devastating. Survivors, called hibakusha, suffered from cancers, leukemia, and genetic damage for decades. Many faced social discrimination in Japan. Children born to exposed parents showed increased rates of birth defects. The Manhattan Project also had victims among those who built it. Workers at Oak Ridge and Hanford were exposed to radiation without adequate protection or warning. Many didn't know they were handling radioactive materials. Cancer rates among these workers were higher than the general population. The government denied responsibility for decades. Even Los Alamos itself carried hidden costs. The isolation and secrecy created psychological stress. Security restrictions prevented scientists from discussing their work, even with spouses. Some had nervous breakdowns. At least one physicist committed suicide, possibly related to the stress of the project. Marriages strained under the pressure of secrecy and the knowledge of what they were building. The Manhattan Project stands as one of humanity's greatest achievements and greatest horrors. In just 3 years, starting from theoretical physics barely understood outside academic circles, scientists and engineers created weapons that ended a global war and defined the next 80 years of human history. The technical accomplishments, uranium enrichment, plutonium production, reactor design, implosion physics, electronics, and materials science, would have been impressive individually. Combined, they represented a leap in human capability unlike anything before or since. Yet the price was enormous. 2 cities destroyed, over 200,000 immediate casualties, millions more living under the shadow of nuclear weapons ever since. The hibakusha carried physical and psychological scars for their entire lives. Workers who built the bomb unknowingly sacrificed their health. Communities downwind of test sites paid with increased cancer rates. The scientists who built the bomb lived with complicated legacies. Some, like Edward Teller, advocated for bigger and better weapons, pushing for the hydrogen bomb despite opposition from colleagues including Oppenheimer. Others, like Hans Bethe and Leo Szilard, became peace activists, working to prevent nuclear war. Oppenheimer himself became a controversial figure, supporting international control of atomic energy but opposing the hydrogen bomb. In 1954, his security clearance was revoked in a hearing that destroyed his career, though many believe it was revenge for his opposition to expanded weapons programs. The Manhattan Project proved that science could accomplish almost anything if given sufficient resources, talent, and motivation. It proved that international cooperation, scientists from America, Britain, Canada, and refugees from across Europe working together, could achieve extraordinary results. It proved that large, complex projects could be managed and completed on schedule despite enormous technical challenges. But it also proved that scientific knowledge is morally neutral. The same physics that powers cities can destroy them. The same engineering that cures diseases can create weapons of mass destruction. The Manhattan Project forced humanity to confront uncomfortable truths, that knowledge cannot be unlearned, that some technologies cannot be uninvented, and that scientific advancement does not automatically bring moral progress. Today, more than 80 years after the Trinity test, we live in the world the Manhattan Project created. Nuclear weapons have not been used in war since Nagasaki, a record we should be grateful for but cannot take for granted. 9 nations possess these weapons. Several others could build them quickly if they chose. Terrorist groups seek them. The technology to build a simple gun-type uranium bomb like Little Boy is now available in physics textbooks. Yet nuclear power also offers hope. Modern reactors can generate clean electricity without carbon emissions. Next-generation designs promise even safer, more efficient power production. Medical isotopes from reactors save lives daily. The physics and engineering developed for weapons have been repurposed for peaceful uses. The legacy of the Manhattan Project reminds us that humanity's greatest strengths, curiosity, ingenuity, cooperation, determination, can be directed toward both creation and destruction. The scientists at Los Alamos were not monsters. They were ordinary people, mostly young, working on what they believed was a defensive weapon against the worst regime in modern history. Many later regretted their work. Many didn't. All of them changed the world in ways they couldn't fully predict. As we stand in the 21st century, the questions raised by the Manhattan Project remain urgent. How do we balance scientific freedom with security? How do we prevent proliferation of nuclear weapons while allowing peaceful nuclear technology? How do we honor the sacrifice of those who built these weapons while acknowledging the suffering they caused? How do we ensure that nuclear weapons are never used again? There are no easy answers, but understanding the history, the science, the politics, the human stories behind the Manhattan Project is essential. We must remember not just the technical achievements, but the context, the choices, and the consequences. We must remember the scientists who built the bomb and then campaigned against its use. We must remember the hibakusha who survived and shared their stories so the world would understand the true cost of nuclear war. We must remember that every technological achievement carries responsibility. The Manhattan Project was not just about physics and engineering. It was about human beings making choices in a time of crisis, choices that still echo through our world today. It reminds us that we are capable of extraordinary things and that we must choose carefully what we create, because once created, some things cannot be undestroyed. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most consequential projects engaging, make sure to subscribe to Past Oracle. We explore the hidden stories, the difficult questions, and the human drama behind the events that shaped our world. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next video, and let us know in the comments, how do you think we should remember the Manhattan Project? As a triumph of science, a necessary evil, or a cautionary tale? The conversation continues, and your voice matters. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.